Enjoy historical stories on the History Fix platform. Explore movies, short films, and documentaries. Addressing Gettysburg podcast fans receive an extra $5 off the first year's annual subscription. Sign up at historyfix.com and use promo code Gettysburg. Every subscription includes a 7-day risk-free trial. Escape into history with History Fix.
The 1863 civilians of Gettysburg were reluctant witnesses to the Great Battle. Join Ken Rich, the man in the red shirt, for his historic town walking tours. You could book these tours by emailing ken@gettysburgtownhistory.com. That's ken@gettysburgtownhistory.com. And when you're in town, look for the guy in the red shirt.
Want the freshest cup of coffee in Gettysburg? Then visit 82 Cafe at 82 Steinway Avenue. They roast all of their coffee in-house and have a full coffee bar to keep you caffeinated during your visit. Check them out at www.raggededgerc.com for their menu and shipping options and their freshly roasted coffee. Use promo code Hancock for 10% off your order. That's 82 Cafe at 82 Steinway Avenue across from the Dobbin House or raggededgerc.com.
This episode of Addressing Gettysburg is brought to you in part by me, audiobook narrator Mike Scott, narrator of Savis Beattie's Bloody Autumn, the Shenandoah Valley campaign of 1864, and Unlike Anything That Ever Floated, the Monitor and Virginia and the Battle of Hampton Roads. If you are an author or publisher interested in having your titles produced as audiobooks, or even just in learning more about the process, give me a shout. You can find my contact info on my website, MikeScottVoice.com. That's MikeScottVoice.com.
And Civil War Trails. It's the world's largest open-air museum, and they offer over 1,300 sites across 6 states. Drive the Gettysburg campaign turn by turn, paddle to Frederick Douglass's birthplace, or hike to remote earthworks and artillery positions. Visit civilwartrails.org to request a brochure and explore their interactive map. Follow Civil War Trails and create some history of your own. All 3 episodes of Addressing Gettysburg are brought to you by our sponsors and our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. To become a sponsor, send an email to matt@addressinggettysburg.com. And to be a patron, go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg today. And we thank you in advance.
Nobody has seen it for almost 70 years because of that platform. So, and it's an original boulder. So it's been undisturbed for 70 years. So we're finding things like that out. They also told me the archaeologists did work up there before the project really started. About 50% of the artifacts they uncovered are battle-era artifacts, and the other 50% is bottle caps, coins, things like that. And the battle-related artifacts are what you would expect: bullets, belt buckles, things like that. Nothing that's going to change the interpretation of what happened up there. They've also cleared some brush out. So if you were staying on Old Sykes Avenue, you have a nice clear view of the Vincent Woody Monument. That was downhill from the 44th New York. Now some of that's going to be revegetated. How high it's going to go is going to depend on interpretive opportunities and things like that. So it's coming along. It's probably pretty much right on schedule. Not for this summer, but for next spring. Spring of 24.
That's a long stretch.
How's that?
It's a long stretch.
Yes. But it's going to be worth it in the end.
Is the park going to do anything about the beavers?
Is the what now?
The park going to do anything with the beavers?
My understanding is the beavers are in the process of leaving.
Oh, are they? Okay.
And once they're gone, then we'll do something with Plum Run.
Because the one statue is got lots of
Island
water around it.
surrounded.
Yeah, an island, yeah.
What's funny, when I started here back in the 90s, and I gave walks in that area, you just had to take 2 or 3 steps off Crawford Avenue, even in the middle of the summer, and the ground got soggy.
Oh, yeah.
So it is kind of a swamp down there to begin with. The beavers, yes, made it swampy.
So it's possible these are reenactor beavers?
Maybe. We don't know. How's everybody doing this afternoon? Good? All right. First of all, on behalf of the National Park Service, Let me welcome everybody to our 2023 Winter Lecture Series. My name's Ranger Karlton Smith, and I'll be with you this afternoon talking about George Dewey in the Civil War. Now, if you've ever heard anything about George Dewey, it's in relation to the Battle of Manila Bay during the Spanish-American War in 1898. But I looked at this and said, everybody has to start someplace. And George Dewey is going to get his start in the American Civil War. But on entering Manila Bay, Dewey thought about his Civil War experience. And he wrote, "It was 36 years since, as executive officer of the Mississippi, I was first under fire in the passage of Forts Jackson and St. Philip under Farragut. And 35 years since, as executive officer, I have lost my ship in the attempted passage of Port Hudson. Then as now, we were dependent upon the screen of darkness to get by successfully. But then I was a subordinate, and now the supreme responsibility was mine." Dewey was born in Montpelier, Vermont on December 26, 1837. And after attending Norwich Academy in Vermont, he's appointed an acting midshipman to the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. He's going to enter in 1854 with 60 acting midshipmen. After 4 years, he'll leave on June 18, 1858, standing fifth out of 15 graduates. So a lot of pressure on Annapolis for these young men. And he's going to pass at that point from acting midshipman to midshipman. At that time, the Navy required Academy graduates to take a 2-year tour on ship before actually getting a commission. But Dewey also wrote, "When you enter the Academy, you cease to be a Vermonter or a Georgian or a Californian. You are in the Navy. Your future with its sea service and its frequent changes of assignment makes you first a man of the country service and only secondly a man of the world." Dewey will serve his 2-year cruise on the USS Wabash, commissioned in 1856, so a relatively new ship. He's going to take a 2-year cruise in the Mediterranean. When he returns to the United States, he'll take his final examination in January of 1861, now standing third in his class. He's going to be promoted to past midshipman on January 28, 1861. And past midshipman was today's equivalent of an ensign. 1 month later, on February 28th, he's promoted to master, today's equivalent of lieutenant junior grade. And on April 19th, 1861, Dewey is promoted to lieutenant. So 3 promotions essentially in 4 months. But now it's wartime, and promotion can come quick sometimes in wartime. The Navy that George Dewey enters into in 1861 had 90 vessels on the books. Only 42, though, were in commission. 27 were not in commission, meaning they were laid up mainly for repairs, and 21 ships were considered unserviceable. Of those 42 ships, only 12 ships win the home squadron when the Civil War breaks out. The Navy itself numbered roughly 10,000 officers and enlisted men. And President Lincoln sets the Navy a high assignment to blockade the entire coast of the Confederacy. Eventually, this will result in 4 blockading squadrons, covering over 12,000 miles of coastline. And by 1865, the Navy has grown to 671 ships of all sizes, and has grown to include 51,500 enlisted men. It's estimated that about 118,000 men served in the U.S. Navy during the war, as opposed to almost 2 million men in the Army. So now you know why you don't hear too much about the Navy in the Civil War. I also discovered a great photograph of a GAR post in Massachusetts, probably sometime in the 1880s, 1890s. And it shows all these Army veterans, and in the back row is one Navy guy holding up his cutlass so people can see him. So there's about 50 Army veterans there and one Navy guy. Dewey's going to be assigned to the USS Mississippi on May 10, 1861, under Captain Thomas Suffridge, a veteran of the War of 1812. The Mississippi itself was a side-wheel frigate commissioned in 1841 and served as Commodore Perry's flagship for the expedition to Japan in the mid-1850s. But Dewey apparently is also starting to gain something of a reputation, because Captain Theodore Bailey commanded the USS Colorado off of Fort Pickens, Florida, will write to the Secretary of the Navy on November 6, 1861, stating, "For future active operations against the enemy, and to encounter the winter storms so frequent on this coast, it is necessary that the ship should have able and competent officers. May I ask of the department to detail Lieutenant Watson Smith and Lieutenant George Dewey, now on board the steamer Mississippi, for duty on board this ship." So somehow Bailey's already heard about George Dewey and whatever it is he's doing. The Navy Department is not going to grant Captain Bailey his request, and Dewey's going to stay on the Mississippi. Eventually, Commander Melancton Smith will relieve Suffridge of command of the Mississippi. By that time, the 6 officers senior to Dewey had been reassigned, leaving Dewey as the next senior officer and by default, the executive officer of the Mississippi. In the Navy, the executive officer is basically the second in command of the ship. The ship itself is assigned to the West Gulf Blockading Squadron under the command of Flag Officer David Farragut. And there are questions being raised about Dewey's youth and his inexperience. So Farragut apparently got in touch with Smith about this and asking Smith his opinion. Smith apparently wrote back and said, "Dewey is doing all right. I don't want a stranger here." And apparently Farragut's attitude was, "It's your ship. If you want Dewey, we'll keep him and see how he goes." So Dewey is now serving as executive officer of the Mississippi, which means Dewey has a chance on occasion to observe Flag Officer David Farragut. And Dewey said that Farragut was not one of the captains whose initiative had been weakened by age. You have to remember, Farragut was born in 1800, so he's 62 years old at this point. The only criticism offered of him was that possibly he had too much of it, but that proved a very winning fault for him. The Dewey Farragut had always been my ideal of the naval officer: urbane, decisive, indomitable. Farragut's target, if you will, is the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, the 7th largest city in the United States with a population of over 180,000. It's the only city in the South with a population over 100,000. It's the largest slave market in the United States. It's the commercial heart of the Deep South. Half of all the cotton in the United States passes through New Orleans, about 1.4 million bales of cotton, followed by tobacco and sugar. It's 3 times more cotton going through New Orleans than Mobile, Alabama, which is the 2nd largest exporter of cotton. New Orleans also houses the U.S. Mint and Customs House, and the Confederate Navy established an ordnance depot in New Orleans, and local shipbuilders are producing some very innovative warships, including an early ironclad called the CSS Manassas. Farragut Squadron will cross the bar at the mouth of the Mississippi River, and it'll get underway by midnight of April 23rd, 1862, to go past Forts Jackson and St. Philip. The Mississippi itself is in the 1st Division and the 3rd ship in line. But Dewey said Smith came to him right before they started. "I cannot see in the light," Smith declared, with characteristic bravery. "I am going to leave that to you, Dewey. You have younger eyes." So Captain Smith's going to take charge of the battery. He's going to leave the helming of the ship to Dewey in Dewey's first combat assignment. Dewey also reported the shot and shell were flying and bursting around us in all directions, crashing through our ship, scattering splinters and boats on all sides, killing and wounding our men in a terrible manner. Dewey's going to spy the Manassas. And he's going to try to run it down, but the Manassas sheared off at the last minute to avoid the collision. The Manassas then will strike the Mississippi just aft of the port paddle wheel, but causing no significant damage. Smith now wants to ram the Manassas himself, but he thinks he needs permission to do it. Dewey reported then that the Hartford, Farragut's flagship, smoke blackened from the fire which the firecraft had caused, and looking a veritable battle-stained and triumphant veteran of war, came steaming by. Farragut was under rigging, his face eager with victory in the morning light, and his eyes snapping. "Run down the ram," he called. So Dewey now turns the Mississippi to ram the Manassas, and again at the last minute, the Manassas swerves to avoid the collision, but runs aground, and the crew has to abandon ship and scuttle it. Eventually, the Mississippi, like the rest of the squadron, will make its way off the port of New Orleans. In his official report, Captain Smith stated, "I have much pleasure in mentioning the efficient service rendered by Executive Officer George Dewey, who kept the vessel in her station during the engagement, a task exceedingly difficult from the darkness and thick smoke that enveloped us from the fire of our vessel and the burning gunboats." But Dewey, this is not necessarily a comfortable assignment, being on the Mississippi River. Dewey remembered being on board of a man of war off New Orleans through the summer was like being in a floating oven. It was out of the question to sleep in our cabins. We slept on deck. I do not suppose that the character of the mosquitoes on the Mississippi has changed with the passage of time. Now, Farragut, after New Orleans, did take part of his fleet upriver to Vicksburg. But where New Orleans is at sea level, Vicksburg's on a 300-foot bluff. And they are not going to surrender to a bunch of ships commanded by Farragut. So he eventually had to fall back to New Orleans. Meanwhile, the Confederates will reinforce the batteries at Vicksburg and also reinforce the defenses at Port Hudson, just below Vicksburg itself. So Farragut now plans to launch an attack on Port Hudson, to get past Port Hudson and perhaps blockade the Red River from sending supplies up to Vicksburg. On March 14, 1863, at 10 o'clock at night, Farragut will start to run the batteries at Port Hudson. The Mississippi is the fourth ship in line. Dewey remembered almost immediately after we were engaged, a pall of smoke settled over the river and hung there, thickening with the progress of the cannonading. Now, there was a pilot on board the Mississippi to get him past some of the shoals in the river. And he thought he had done he had gone past the last shoal and ordered the Mississippi put on full steam. He miscalculated and said the Mississippi ran right into the shoal and got stuck, and they couldn't get it off. They tried to lighten the ship, do anything they could, but whatever they did, the ship just would not budge. It stuck there fast. The first thing Smith and Dewey decided to do, they had to evacuate the ship, but they wanted to get the wounded off first. So utilizing the boats from the ship, Dewey would lead them to the far shore on the opposite side from Port Hudson to get the wounded off. The reason Dewey went with the boats is there was some concern they might not come back to the ship. So they're constantly running back and forth to get the wounded off. But they can't let the ship fall into the hands of the Confederates. So they started to set fires in different parts of the ship. Dewey remembered the fire we had started in the wardroom broke through the skylight in a great burst of flame, illuminating the whole after part of the ship. It must have revealed our boat clearly, and was a signal to those on the bluffs along the banks to break out into that rebel yell, which I then heard in full chorus of victory for the first and last time in my life. It was not pleasant to the ear. But after making sure the fires are set and the ship's not going to be captured, this in the best naval tradition, Captain Smith and Lieutenant Dewey will be the last ones to leave the ship. And again, Captain Smith reported, "I consider that I should be neglecting a most important duty should I omit to mention the coolness of my executive officer, Mr. George Dewey." With their ship now gone, the officers and crew report back to New Orleans. And the post commander there, Commodore Henry W. Morris, was assigned Dewey to duty as a prize commissioner. Now, in the Civil War, if the U.S. Navy captured an enemy ship, a merchant ship or a warship, something like that, the government would sell it at auction, the contents and everything. The government would collect half the money from that auction. The other half was given to the crew as what was called as prize money, almost like a bonus for capturing the ship. As you might expect, the captain of the ship got half of that prize money because he's the captain. So Dewey's job is to make sure this process works out smoothly. Eventually, though, he's ordered to USS Monongahela under the command of Captain Abner Reed. Because Farragut's flagship, the Hartford, is now north of Port Hudson, blockading the Red River. Whenever Farragut is back in New Orleans, he makes the Monongahela his temporary flagship. So Dewey sees Farragut personally on almost a daily basis when he's back there. And Dewey wrote that Farragut was not given to lengthy written detail. His was the supreme gift of directness and simplicity in great affairs, so valuable in time of war. Valuable as the training of Annapolis was, it was poor schooling beside that of serving with Farragut in time of war. Below Port Hudson is the town of Donaldsonville, Louisiana. And guerrillas in the area have been firing on Farragut's ship going up and down the river. So on about August 10th, 1862, Farragut issued orders to burn part of the town in retaliation of this Confederate activity. The town itself will be captured by Union forces on October 25th, 1862. But on July 7th, 1863, the Monongahela and the New London are patrolling the river between Donaldsonville and New Orleans when they engage Confederate batteries 12 miles below Donaldsonville. A shell smashed through the bulwarks of the ship on a port quarter, wounding Captain Reed in the abdomen and the right knee, causing his death the next day. leaving Dewey again in command of the Monongahela. Dewey remembered that he, Reed, and Captain Jenkins and myself were standing near each other on the quarterdeck, and we had fired only a few shots when there was a blinding flash in my eyes. I felt the stunning effect of the concussion of an exploding shell, which always raises the question of whether you will be alive or dead the next second. But again, Dewey's coming to the notice of senior officers. Captain Thornton Jenkins, the senior officer afloat, reported that Lieutenant Dewey, the executive officer of this vessel, the other officers and the crew displayed an unrivaled coolness and courage during the entire action. And another officer reported Lieutenant Commander Dewey displayed coolness, skill, and judgment in managing the Monongahela and in getting off the New London. He was able to use his bow and stern guns and boat howitzers, and was passing the batteries, he did so effectively. Dewey's going to be assigned to the USS Brooklyn, a screw sloop under the command of Captain George Emmons. The ship itself is assigned to the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron under the command of Rear Admiral John Dahlgren. When the ship reaches Charleston, South Carolina, it's discovered that Dahlgren only wanted Captain Emmons and not the ship. So Emmons stays in Charleston, and the ship itself goes to the Brooklyn Navy Yard for repairs and re-equipment. Dewey is going to be reassigned, and by that time, Captain James Alden's in command of the Brooklyn. And for some reason, he, along with some other officers, again thought Dewey was too young for the role of executive officer for the Brooklyn. So Dewey's going to be reassigned to the USS Garryowen, a side-wheel gunboat, or what was designated as a double-ender. In other words, this ship is designed to proceed in either direction without having to turn around. It has a rudder at both ends. And in case you're wondering, in this particular photo, I think towards the right is the stern of the ship, because that's where the American flag is. And Dewey apparently wasn't quite sure about this assignment. He's under the command of Commander A.C. Rind. But Dewey said, "My friends explained to me that I had been given this task in organization and discipline because I had made a reputation as an executive officer equal to any emergency. However that may be, there can be no doubt that both the crew of the Garryowen and the nature of the vessel and the service expected of her gave me quite enough to do from the moment that I reported on board her in November 1863 until I was detached from her a year later."
For the Historian has a wide variety of titles, new and used, of military books from publishers like Osprey, Gettysburg Publishing, Stackpole, Savas Beatty, UNC Press, and more. I make it a point to go there once a week because I have new bookshelves to fill and I never know what treasures I'll find, and neither will you. They even have toy soldiers, model kits, games, children's books, and more. So stop by and check them out on your next visit to Gettysburg, or better yet, order right now online at forthehistorian.com and mention that you heard about them on Addressing Gettysburg in the Note to Seller box, and they will refund you your shipping. And if you call 717-685-5207 or stop by the store on your next visit and mention us, you'll get 20% off retail price. That's forthehistorian.com or 717-685-5207.
If you're a lover of history, then go to trhistorical.com. There you'll find apparel, decor, and gear, and our listeners will receive 10% off plus free shipping within the U.S. if you use promo code GBERG1863 at checkout. So take advantage of this deal at trhistorical.com. TR Historical, for the love of history.
You've heard us promote various ways that you can help us keep the show going, but one way we haven't pushed too much is our sutlery at addressinggettysburg.com/shop. That's a shame because we have designs over there by talented artists like Ty DeWitt of 1863 Designs and Mike Stretch of the Heritage Depot. So now we're promoting it. Buying shirts, hoodies, mugs, and other items from our sutlery not only helps us keep the lights on, but it also helps guys like Ty and Mike, and it helps spread the word about the show every time you wear an item or you sip from your mug. So head over to addressinggettysburg.com/shop and grab some merch. It's the perfect Christmas gift for the Gettys nerd in your family. That's addressinggettysburg.com/shop.
Hey, Gettysburg business owners. Winter is just around the bend, and you know what that means. No tourists. But just because people aren't coming to you doesn't mean you can't bring your business to them. If you ship, you're still in the game. And if you're a seasonal business, the time to advertise for your next season is in the off-season when people are making their plans. So what's an affordable yet highly effective way of reaching those people? Well, it's not radio, it's not TV, and it's certainly not print. Step out of the Jurassic era of advertising and run an ad on Addressing Gettysburg. We just reached 1 million downloads, and we're growing by the tens of thousands every month. Beyond that, our audience is happy to support those who support their favorite podcast. So email sales@addressinggettysburg for more information about advertising on our show. We look forward to helping your business grow. That's sales@addressinggettysburg.com.
Now, the Garryowen being on the James River is part of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron. And whenever the acting Rear Admiral, Samuel P. Lee, is on the James River, the Garryowen will serve as his flagship, supporting Major General Benjamin Butler's campaigns along the James River. Dewey reported the most important action was the firing of Confederate batteries at 4 Mile Creek on July 28, 1864, along with the USS Mendota, with Dewey apparently in temporary command of the Garryowen. Because Dewey's official report stated, we kept up a continuous fire for 4 hours until our ammunition was exhausted. But we had pretty well silenced the enemy before we drew off. And on the succeeding days, we did not have to endure so heavy a fire. Dewey remembered that in one sense, the fighting was the easiest part of the work. The hard part was life aboard the stuffy double-ender in the midst of heat and mosquitoes, striving all the while to develop a kind of efficiency suited to the task for which such a clumsy craft was adapted. Eventually, Dewey's going to be reassigned to the USS Colorado, a screw frigate with a complement of about 675 officers and men. And he will be assigned to this ship as the executive officer. The ship is assigned again to the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron, but by this time, Admiral Lee's been replaced by Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter. The Colorado itself is under the command of Commodore Henry K. Thatcher. And Dewey wrote that Thatcher welcomed me on board heartily, notwithstanding my youth. He said that the ship was in a bad state and gave me full authority in the government of the crew of 700 men. If the state of insubordination on board had been responsible for Porter's desire to have me become executive of the Colorado, then I felt myself bound to live up to his expectations. So apparently Dewey believed that Admiral Porter specifically assigned him to the Colorado to get it in shape. He remembered on the first morning he called the crew to quarters. Some of the crew didn't appear at quarters, and the officers didn't want to go down to get them. So Dewey said, I went among the hammocks, and whenever I found one occupied, I tipped the man out of it. And I aimed to do this in a way that left no doubt of the businesslike intentions of the new regime. The men saw that I meant to be obeyed, and afterward, when I called all hands, all appeared on deck. Now again, keep in mind, this is a time when you were a crewman, you slept in a hammock that might be a couple feet in the air. So if you're up here and you get tipped out of it, you're going to remember it. So Dewey is putting his imprint on the crew right away. Now, Porter's target is going to be Fort Fisher, guarding Wilmington, North Carolina at the mouth of the Cape Fear River. Wilmington is the last port open to blockade runners. So they need to close this port. The first assault is going to be December 23rd, 1864. The Navy lays down a heavy bombardment of the fort itself to try to clear the way for the Army. Now, the Army under Benjamin Butler will land, but Butler feels the fort is not softened up enough, doesn't even try to make an assault, and returns back to the ships. Butler's going to be replaced. So the new commander and Porter go back to Fort Fisher, and the second assault is going to take place on January 13th, 1865. And this time the Army will land and prepare for an assault. And the Porter squadron will again open fire on the fort to prepare the way. By this time, Admiral Porter had felt that in a situation like this, the Navy might soften everything up. The Army goes in and takes the fort and claims the bulk of the credit. So Porter decides to organize a landing party of 1,600 sailors and 400 Marines to also assault the fort. Now keep in mind, these are sailors and not Army. So the sailors are not trained in infantry tactics. They're not trained to act as a 1,600-man unit in a sense. And the only weapons they're taking with them are what they would take to board the ship, meaning basically cutlasses and pistols. And that's it. Now, Dewey, as executive officer of the Colorado, should have had the ship's contention. But Thatcher was the senior officer of the fleet next to Porter. So if anything happened to Porter, Thatcher would take command of the squadron, and Dewey would take command of the Colorado. And Thatcher apparently wasn't quite ready to do that. So Dewey stays on board of the Colorado. And Dewey reported the Colorado's part during the day was the same as that of the previous bombardment. We joined the other ships in pounding the batteries as hard as we could with all our guns. How terrific that bombardment may be realized when I say that in the 2 days Porter's fleet discharged against Fort Fisher over 18,000 shells. So it meant the naval assault is going to fail miserably. But because the naval assault started before the Army, the Confederate defenders came down to this part of the fort to defend it, leaving the rest of the fort basically unguarded, and the Army can now sweep in and take the fort. And again, Commodore Thatcher is going to state, I should, however, be doing injustice to the executive officer, Lieutenant George Dewey, were I not to mention the invaluable assistance which he gave me in having all the departments of the ship in perfect order for battle, as well as for the valuable aid in the management of the ship during the action. Now, shortly after this, Admiral Farragut is asked to give his opinion on the new guns and type of ships being developed for the Navy. Farragut wrote to the Secretary of the Navy, I think the world is sadly mistaken when it supposes that battles are won by this or that kind of gun or vessel. The best gun and the best vessel should certainly be chosen, but the victory 3 times out of 4 depends upon those who fight them. What signifies the size and caliber of the gun if you do not hit your adversary? And at the Manila Bay, Dewey would echo those same sentiments. On March 3rd, 1865, Dewey is promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Commander and assigned to the USS Kearsarge, who will also serve as executive officer again on the USS Colorado in the Mediterranean. From 1862 to 1867, George Dewey would serve as executive officer on 9 different ships. Dewey is going to marry Susan Boardman Goodwin, the daughter of New Hampshire's wartime governor, on October 24th, 1867. One son, George Goodwin Dewey, will be born on December 23rd, 1872. Unfortunately, Susan Dewey died 5 days later, on December 28th, from complications of childbirth. But in 1868, Dewey was assigned to the U.S. Naval Academy, his first real shore duty in 9 years. He's placed in charge of 4th class midshipmen and in general charge of the ships stationed at the Academy. His next shipboard assignment will be the USS Narragansett. He will be promoted to the rank of commander on April 13th, 1872. He is appointed as lighthouse inspector for the 2nd District headquarters in Boston, and also served as naval secretary to the Lighthouse Board in 1878 in Washington, D.C. In October of 1882, he's assigned to USS Juniata, but this assignment will be cut short due to illness. He is promoted to captain on September 27th, 1884. In 1885, Dewey's assigned as commanding officer to the USS Pensacola, a veteran of the Battle of New Orleans, and will serve a 3-year tour of duty in the European squadron. Afterwards, Dewey remembered, the return trip across the Atlantic with the Pensacola was my last experience on board a ship that carried sail, and my last sea service until I was to hoist my Commodore's broad pennant. In July of 1889, Captain Dewey is assigned as Chief of the Bureau of Equipment, Navy Department in Washington, D.C. In October 1895, he's made President of the Board of Inspection and Survey, which oversaw the planning and the final outfitting for the new Steel Navy. So here's George Dewey, who's gone from engine-powered wooden sail ships. He has seen the beginning of the Navy's Iron Navy in the Civil War, and now he's going to be viewing the Navy's new Steel Navy, whose ships would not carry masts and sails. So he's seen a complete revolution in the Navy since the Civil War. On May 23, 1896, Dewey is promoted to Commodore, with a little help from Assistant Navy Secretary Theodore Roosevelt. And Roosevelt viewed Dewey as being proactive in his Navy career, and someone who, like Roosevelt, disliked red tape. On October 27, 1897, Dewey is ordered the command of the Asiatic Squadron and assumed command at Nagasaki, Japan on January 3, 1898, without receiving the temporary rank of acting rear admiral, which usually came with command of a squadron. Now, some people feel that Secretary Long did not give him that acting position because he felt he got the rank of Commodore through political influence somehow. So that's why right now Dewey is still a Commodore, even though he commands a squadron. His flagship will be the USS Olympia, a heavy cruiser in the Navy. During these months he's in command, Dewey is constantly drilling his squadron in battle tactics and gunnery. And he's stocking up supplies in Hong Kong for anything that might come down the road. On April 26, 1898, Dewey receives the following telegram from Washington. War has commenced between the United States and Spain. Proceed at once to the Philippine Islands. Commence operations particularly against the Spanish fleet. You must capture vessels or destroy. Use utmost endeavor. As he's sitting in Manila Bay, let me see if I can get this. Here we go. As he's entering Manila Bay, Dewey has to pass the Spanish fortifications on Corregidor, and they had a line of mines set up to try to stop him. But under cover of darkness, Dewey would take a squadron and enter Manila Bay. But when he's doing that, and in the planning stage of this, Dewey said, whenever I have been in a difficult situation, or in the midst of such a confusion of details, that the simple and right thing to do seemed hazy, I have often asked myself, what would Farragut do? In the course of the preparations for Manila Bay, I often asked myself this question, and I confess I was thinking of him the night that we entered the bay, and with the conviction that I was doing precisely what he would have done. Remember, Farragut attacks New Orleans and Port Hudson under cover of night, and Dewey's trying to do the same thing to at least enter the harbor of Manila. At 5:30 a.m. on May 1st, 1898, Dewey issues his famous order, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." And that was an order to Captain Charles Gridley, commanding officer of the Olympia, to open fire. Gridley was also a veteran of the Battle of Mobile Bay under Farragut, and he was married to the niece of Strong Vincent. So those of you who didn't think I'd get Gettysburg in here today. And believe it or not, when the U.S. Navy enters Manila Bay, this is going to be the first time the United States Navy has been involved in a fleet-to-fleet action in its history. You know, in the Revolutionary War, it was just privateers. The War of 1812, it's single-ship action. The Confederates never established a navy in the Civil War, so it squadrons against what we call mosquito fleets, just 4 or 5 vessels trying to stop Farragut, and that was it. So this is the first fleet-to-fleet action the United States ever fought. And by the end of the action, the Spanish fleet is basically destroyed at the cost of only 8 wounded American men in Dewey's squadron. For this victory, Dewey is promoted to the rank of Rear Admiral, officially on May 11th, 1898. And he later wrote that this action confirms my early experiences under Admiral Farragut, that combats are decided more by skill in gunnery and the quality of the guns than by all else. The second lesson of this battle is the complete demonstration of the value of high-grade men. Cheap men are not wanted, are not needed, or are lost to the United States Navy. This figure was so important that Congress even established the Dewey Medal, and it was awarded to every seaman and Marine involved with the fleet. Admiral Dewey's picture is on the front, and then this image on the reverse with the name of the ships on the bottom. Dewey is going to marry Mildred McLean Hazen, the widow of Union General William Babcock Hazen, on November 9th, 1899. They were married in the rectory of St. Paul's Catholic Church in Washington, D.C. Dewey himself was not a Catholic. That's why at the time they couldn't be married in the church, they had to be married in the rectory. Congress will also create the rank of Admiral of the Navy on March 24th, 1903, backdated to March 2nd, 1899. And this was a unique rank created only for George Dewey. It allowed him, among other things, to serve for life. And it said grade and rank to exist only during the lifetime of this officer. So again, it's a unique rank established only for George Dewey. And here you see Dewey wearing the Dewey Medal. But it might be a little hard to see, he's wearing the reverse of the medal. He felt that his image on the front of it, people said he was too modest to wear his own image on the front. And that's why he's wearing the reverse of it on his uniform. Dewey is also made president of the General Board of the Navy in 1900. Now, the job of the board was to prepare war plans, recommend the types of armament of ships in the annual building program, and act as a clearinghouse for all questions of naval policy. The board started to lose influence in 1917 with the creation of the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, and was discontinued at the end of World War II. Admiral Dewey himself passed away on January 16, 1917, at the age of 80, still on active duty after 62 years of service. Dewey was initially buried in Arlington National Cemetery. A mausoleum was completed for his remains in 1924, but his wife decided to transfer the remains to the Bethlehem Chapel crypt level of the Washington National Cathedral. And that's where the Admiral rests today. One of the great traditions of navies throughout the world is to name ships after famous and important individuals. And George Dewey is no exception. The USS Dewey DD-349, a destroyer, was commissioned in 1934. On December 7, 1941, while trying to break out of Pearl Harbor, the ship fires on Japanese planes as they're trying to break out, and later patrolled the Hawaiian waters. The Dewey will also do service at the Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, and Guam, among other places, earning 13 battle stars. The ship will be decommissioned in 1945. The next Dewey, DLG-14, was a guided missile frigate and commissioned in 1959. She was decommissioned 10 years later and then redesigned and recommissioned as the DDG-45, a guided missile destroyer, and recommissioned in June of 1975. She was decommissioned in 1990. The current USS Dewey, DDG-105, a guided missile destroyer, was commissioned in 2010. She had one time served as part of Destroyer Squadron 1, Kaya Strike Group 1, with the flagship USS Carl Vinson. Dewey is best known today for his victory at Manila Bay, but he received his first combat training in the Civil War. He became known in the Civil War for his coolness, courage, efficient service, skill, and judgment. The lessons Dewey picked up in the Civil War and the example of Civil War sailors such as Farragut will serve Dewey well in the planning and fighting at Manila Bay and helped lead to one of the greatest U.S. naval victories of all time. I want to thank you folks for joining me this afternoon. I'll be here for a few minutes if anybody has any questions. If you don't want to stay around for a question and answer session, feel free to leave at any time. But once again, I want to thank you for joining me today and for coming back to Gettysburg. Thank you. Yes.
How did he take care of his only child when he had such a glorious career and his wife died 5 days afterwards, and what became of that child?
It appears that George Goodwin Dewey was raised by his maternal aunts. I don't get the impression that Admiral Dewey had much to do with his upbringing. There is a story I've read that Dewey was kind of vain about his looks, I guess. And one time he was escorting some ladies somewhere. I don't know what year this was or anything like that, but he happened to meet his son along the way. And he quickly introduced his son as his younger brother. The son died, I have it in here. I want to say the son died in 1965. Died in 1963. I believe he graduated from Harvard, worked on Wall Street, and his obituary did say he had become a millionaire because of that. But George Goodwin Dewey, as far as I know, never married, never had children, so there are no descendants of Admiral Dewey today. And he died in Chicago, by the way. Anything else? No. Yeah, somebody up here?
Do I understand correctly that George Dewey and his son were born on the same day, 23rd of December? Did I see that right?
Yeah, George Goodwin was born December 23rd, and George Dewey was born December 26th.
Oh, December, that's right.
So 3 days apart.
Okay, 3 days ago. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And there was another question here?
Well, I just wanted to know, is Samuel Lee related in any way to Robert E. Lee?
Yes, Admiral Samuel Phillips Lee was a cousin of Robert E. Lee. He was married to one of the daughters of the Blair family. So that he had that connection with the Blair family as well. And that's probably one of the things that helped him get command to begin with. The Blair family being one of the most important and powerful families in mid-19th century America. Anything else? All right, I'll be down here for a few minutes in case you want to come down and ask. But once again, we're thanking you for coming today, and we'll see you all next week. Thank you.
Need a Corps badge or other insignia for your uniform? Then check out the Badge Maker. Here's what some of his satisfied customers had to say. Miranda said, I ordered an identification disc from Joe and it's fantastic. He hand-stamped it exactly as I wanted. Greg said, my unit has purchased from him in the past quality badges and good service. And Jerry S. says, the Badge Maker is the go-to place for accurate replica Civil War badges. So go to CivilWarCorpsBadges.com and attach a message with your order saying you heard about him on Addressing Gettysburg.
Our hearts so stout have got us fame, for soon 'tis known from whence we came. Wherever we go, they dread the name of Garryowen in glory. Instead, smile, drink down